In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the origins of hospice as we understand it now. And in order to do that, we need to go back into Christian history. And so I'm building on that earlier lecture that gave kind of the context of the period. And we see as Christianity is developing its institutions, one of the key aspects is the idea of the pilgrimage. And I'm going to be talking about what pilgrimage is in a moment. So the image on the right is of the city of Jerusalem, which many of you will know is the most sacred city for Christianity because it's believed to be where Jesus himself was preaching and first developing his community, and where he was crucified. And so unsurprisingly, it becomes the site of extreme devotion, and so people want to travel there. This continues to be the case, and as you will know, this is a very contested site. It's also a holy city for Muslims and Jews, and this ongoing tension has been playing out, and it's been playing out in particular currently with with the war in Gaza, which is we just have a peace deal now, although we'll see if it holds. I hope so. So the city of Jerusalem, as I said, has been considered holy for these three Abrahamic traditions. And then on the left, we see an image of medieval pilgrims on their way to what they would have been calling the Holy Land. Before I go any further, I do want to talk about the idea of pilgrimage. Now, some of you, I think, will have taken my pilgrimage course, and it's a topic all unto itself. And certainly, as many of you will know, pilgrimage is a common practice across the world's traditions. We see, of course, the pilgrimage to Mecca that millions of Muslims undertake every year. Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism all have sites of pilgrimage. And so this is a very important practice, although it's always interesting to me that it's still not really understood by many people, and that speaks to the fact that we live in a very secular society, where there's a lot of misunderstanding about religion. And so I just want to get at what is pilgrimage. And one of the first things I talk about in my pilgrimage course is the idea of what's the difference between a tourist and a pilgrim. And in fact, that's difficult to say. And I always comment on the fact that many people, when they go on tours of across the globe, they're going to holy sites that pilgrims would have gone to. So there is a kind of a recapitulation there. So the idea of pilgrimage is that there are places in the world more sacred or closer to the divine realm. Okay, so we can only understand pilgrimage within the worldview of religion and spirituality. And so this will depend on the religious tradition. So if it's an indigenous tradition, it's much more likely these pilgrimages are going to be to sacred sites in nature. So although this is true of other traditions, they're often attached to mountains and so on. So sites in nature that are considered to be holy. But the underlying logic, regardless of the tradition, is that some places are holier than others. And so in order to access that energy, you need to go to that place. And so the idea is that we can create a relationship with these divine powers that are to be found in these places, and that by going to these sacred places, we can create a relationship with the divine, so that it's somehow easier that these places, sometimes it's described as the veil is thinner there, that you can come more into touch with sacred forces in these places. And so these will vary. I'll just use Christian examples that are pertinent within this course. There are various shrines within Canada, some of you will know, like the Oratory in Montreal, or Saint Anne de Beaupré in Quebec. So people will go on pilgrimage. Now they're considered very holy, but often it sort of ramps up. And so going to Rome, going to Jerusalem are even higher grades of holy. Although I think it depends, the feeling will depend on the person. But certainly there are sort of levels of sacrality, and part of this is related to the idea of the journey. The journey itself is what makes it a pilgrimage. It's not a pilgrimage to go down the road to the church down the road. although that is obviously still considered to be a site of the sacred. The journey is what defines pilgrimage. And so, from within the logic of pilgrimage, this isn't always explicitly stated. It's actually more explicitly stated in the Hindu tradition, in my experience, that the idea that in undergoing this very challenging journey, you're actually kind of gaining merit. And so within the logic of Hinduism, you're burning off bad karma. But actually, when we look at Catholic pilgrimage, the logic is very similar. So the whole idea is that the journey is difficult. This isn't meant to be some cushy tour. This is it's supposed to be difficult and grueling. And so it's showing your devotion. It's building up your stamina. And also, I go into much more detail about this in my pilgrimage course, but you're meeting other pilgrims, you're creating a kind of a Christian community as a result. And certainly if you watch any documentaries about pilgrimage, there's a very famous movie called The Way about the Compostela pilgrimage, which has become incredibly popular in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. That's a good way to get at it if you're interested in what it would be like to go on one of these pilgrimages. And with the Compostela, it goes through the mountains in France into Spain, and it's a very grueling pilgrimage. And as I said, it's only been gaining in popularity. And it's interesting to think about why we're seeing this incredible renaissance of pilgrimage within the Western world. And there's many articles that have been written on this. Certainly, it relates to the fact that we live in such a virtual society. I mean, this course is online. We're on our phones all the time. When you're on a pilgrimage, you're in your body. You're in the natural landscape. And so it's partly that. I think it's partly spiritual seeking, as it always was. And I myself have called the Compostela the Doubter's Pilgrimage, because much of what I've read about that pilgrimage, many people who go on it are not particularly religious, but they're at some kind of turning point in their own lives. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they're at a transition point, and so they feel the need to get away. And so pilgrimage routes are being used in this interesting way. Now, of course, people still use it in the traditional way, and we see that with Hinduism and Islam, where pilgrimage is just growing in popularity. So this is a very common, very central practice for the world's religious traditions. So I want to talk about the first Christian pilgrims and how they set the template for what's to follow. And we have to start again with Saint Helena, who we discussed earlier in the course. And so this isn't a great image. I just like the look of it, but this is from a picture taken in the holiest church of Christianity for most of the mainstream forms of Christianity. And it's Saint Helena with the true cross. So you're going to be seeing we're going to see a lot of remarkable women in this course and remarkable men. But certainly in the early Christian church, the role of women, I think, is really underplayed a lot of the time and not remembered. And so Helena, as you will recall, is the mother of the Emperor Constantine. And so when he became emperor in 306, he gave his mother the title of Augusta and allowed her free disposal of the imperial treasury. So imagine, he's basically giving her access to the wealth of the entire Roman Empire to do what she wishes. And so as a devout Christian, she starts building churches. And so she's basically the driving force between what starts to be this movement towards the building of Christian buildings across Christendom. And so she then goes on pilgrimage to Palestine. And with all of this money at her disposal, she is able to, again, start building churches in what would have been called the Holy Land. And as I said in the earlier lecture, she discovers the true cross. Now, again, I don't want to get into whether this is true or not. It doesn't really matter from a religious point of view. So it's believed that she finds the cross on which Jesus was crucified, and that's generally how she's depicted. So in this image, she's holding the cross. And so what we see with Helena is she is an institution builder. We saw that already with St. Fabiola and Marcella. So these are the they're upper class Roman women, as well educated as they could be in that time period, knowing many languages, etc. And so she starts to build churches in the most holy sites within Palestine, and so these remain to this day. She oversees the building of a basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem. So, of course, you probably know that it's believed this is where Jesus was born. And this is very typical in religions. The sites that are important to the founder become sacred sites and sacred sites of pilgrimage. And so I saw on the news over Christmas that the Church of the Nativity was open to pilgrims for the first time in many years this year. So that was good news. And we also see that she builds probably the holiest church in all of the Christian world, on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So it's double sacred because it's in the holy city. And so it's built, it's believed to be the site where Jesus was buried and was resurrected. And so this is referred to as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So I've said in other classes, I read somewhere that there's so much infighting within Christianity as there is within many religions. You know, you get different denominations of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. And so there was a lot of fighting about who would hold the key to this most holy site. And according to the story, and I really want to believe this is true, it's a Muslim that holds the key to the holiest church in Christendom. So here's a contemporary form of a map showing the way to Rome and to Jerusalem, the two most important pilgrimage routes for the medieval period. I will be showing a medieval map, which tells you a lot about the way that they were seeing the world quite differently. It wasn't this kind of objective from above way of viewing the world. But I just want you to get a sense of how this was working. And so you can see the way these routes start to connect all these areas. Now, as I pointed out, these weren't understood with the same national boundaries as they are now. But certainly we see these routes beginning to develop, and the church puts money behind making sure that you can go across them with donkeys and horses and so on, or on foot. A lot of people went on foot. So if you went on foot, that's showing extreme devotion, of course. And so we can see that they're making their way to Jerusalem and to Rome. And so I heard just through talking to people that, for instance, in Portugal, there are routes that then connect to the Compostela from Spain, Portugal, and France. And so there are the large pilgrimages of Rome and Jerusalem, and then the smaller pilgrimages within different regions. This is still true today. Some of you will know that for Portuguese people, Fatima is the central pilgrimage. And so I talk about this in my pilgrimage class. Pilgrims travel for a variety of reasons. Religious devotion is one, but certainly it's not the only reason. And if any of you have read Canterbury Tales, it will take away any ideas that people were holier back then. For instance, the widow of Bath is going on pilgrimage to find a new husband. So other people are going to sell trinkets, so it's for money. So I think we have to be careful of thinking, in the medieval period, they were so much more devout. Not necessarily. People have always been people. So there's a variety of reasons why people would go on pilgrimage. And we see in the medieval period the development of the whole idea of relics, so that you go along the way, you could go to other churches or cathedrals or basilicas and buy relics or visit relics that are associated with saints. And so we see this whole complex system of saints and objects associated with them. It could be a bone, it could be an object associated with them that's believed to have holy power. And so this is a whole different system of kind of where the sacred is mapping out these journeys into these different holy areas, but always Rome and Jerusalem being the holiest. The image here is of a medieval map, and I did want to show it because I think it shows much better than me telling how people viewed the world very differently during this time period. And so from a Christian medieval point of view, Jerusalem is the center of the world. And so Mircea Eliade, the religious scholar, talks about how religions create a religious center and everything grows out from that. And so for believing Christians, Jerusalem is the center of the world. For believing Muslims, Mecca is the center. So you pray facing east in both those cases towards the holy center. So this is how your whole life is oriented in this way. It has nothing to do with, longitude and latitude and things like that. It's a religious way of viewing the world. Now, I don't want to make this seem like this is something long ago and far away, because many people still live their lives like this. So for believing Hindus, Varanasi is the most sacred city, and so many people travel there when they're old. Some people actually live there as pilgrims until their death, because it's believed to be the idea that the city itself washes away your sins. And so it is important to note this is a very different view of the world to one that we find in a secular kind of psychology. So following in the footsteps of Helena, we find Egeria. She comes by many different names. We're not quite sure. Etheria, there's many different versions of her name, who is considered to be one of the first pilgrims to Palestine. And so she wrote letters about her journey, and this has continued to be a practice of pilgrims into the modern day, where you write about your journey. It's a spiritual journey. So we think, I don't want to get into the conjecture, there's all sorts of conjecture about who she was, but that she was from what we would now call Spain. And so we think she traveled for 3 years between 381 and 384 CE. So this is very early. So she would be among the very first pilgrims that headed for Palestine and Jerusalem. And so in her works, she uses a kind of colloquial Latin, and also is often addressing other women. So some conjecture is that she was a nun. That would make sense, that she would be a nun. And she gives us this is the beauty of having written text on these practices, that she gives us actual insight into what it would be like to be a pilgrim during that period. From these written documents, we can tell that she was going all over, so a very intrepid person. So she went to Constantinople. She went to various sites around the region of what we now call the Middle East, holy sites. And so she goes to Jerusalem, she goes to Egypt, she goes to Galilee, and she goes to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so she participates in a variety of rituals in those places, which is what pilgrims continue to do into the present day. And she also goes to sites that sort of natural sites that are sacred to the Christian tradition. And so I just wanted to include this example of her writing, just so you have a sense of it. And so this is when she goes to Mount Sinai. And so many of you will know that Mount Sinai is sacred both to Jews and to Christians. It's associated with Moses and bringing down the Ten Commandments, which are followed by both Jews and Christians. And so this is what she writes about this. We reached the mountain late on the Sabbath, and arriving at a certain monastery, the monks who dwelt there received us very kindly, showing us every kindness. There is also a church and a priest there. So we can see that already in the 4th century, these institutions are developing. So there are monasteries and basilicas being built in Palestine, and there are priests and monks living there. We stayed there that night, and early on the Lord's Day, so you can see she arrives on the Sabbath, the holy day within Christianity, and so all of this is just sort of piling sacred on sacred. So you do the pilgrimage up the mountain on the Sabbath. And early on the Lord's Day, together with the priests and monks who dwelt there, we began the ascent of the mountains one by one. These mountains are ascended with infinite toil, for you cannot go up gently by spiral. Okay, so again, we see that idea of the difficulty of the journey being sort of part of the pilgrimage. And so this sets out again a template of the places that Christians continue to go into the present day. So by the 11th and 12th centuries, we see a full development of pilgrimage routes that would have been developing slowly over time. And partly because people like Egeria were writing these accounts, and so people would read them and think, okay, I'm going to go on that too, or they'd hear from their neighbors that they had gone on pilgrimage. And so this slowly develops, and the church is facilitating it. So pilgrimage became increasingly popular within the Christian world. And as you can imagine, this would be a very challenging journey to go to Jerusalem at this time, the state of transportation at that time. And so it was typical that you would do up your will before going because you knew you might not make it back. And so also during the medieval period, you might be sent on pilgrimage rather than being incarcerated. So if you committed some crime, you might go on pilgrimage in expiation of your crime. So as I said, there's various reasons for going on pilgrimage, but certainly, as they say, it was not for the faint of heart. So there were you might be robbed. You're dealing with different weather, with the weather. You're dealing with disease and so on. And so, as a related to this larger development, we see hospitals, what we call hospices. And so, as I said in the first lecture, these two words have the same root. And so the idea that these buildings are built by the church for pilgrims, and increasingly they're also providing health care. And so that's where we really start to see the connection between what we, in the contemporary period, we call hospice. So it's developing out of need of these pilgrims who are away from their homes and so have to be cared for or have to be nursed if they fall ill in a variety of ways. So if we read contemporary accounts of pilgrimage, this has not changed. I was reading one a few years ago where on the Compostela, the person, something went wrong with their feet, which is unsurprising, and they had to go to hospital. So this would be a very common occurrence. And so we see the hospices developing to fulfill this function. And so they grow up along these pilgrimage routes. Now, these are not meant to be hotels, although, as I said, that has the same actually root in language, but they're not meant to be. And so if I couldn't find a good image, but if you go inside they're just like, even now, if you go on the Compostela, it's bunk beds. It's meant to be very basic. There's nothing luxurious about it. And so typically you would have also a church attached or a shrine attached to the hospice, so you could do prayers and rituals, but that would be it. It would be very bare bones and basic because that's part of the process of pilgrimage. This image is actually contemporary, as you can tell, although the buildings are very old, of what a hostel might look like now. But certainly, as I said, by the 11th and 12th centuries, these were developing. And so this process has a huge impact economically, and this is still true. If we look at Mecca, a huge part of the Saudi Arabian economy is coming from pilgrimage. So we see whole towns developing because they're on these pilgrimage routes. And so it becomes what's been called the pilgrimage industry, and it changes the whole face of what would have been called Christendom at that time. And it's interesting to see, and I will talk about this at the very end, that this continues to be the case. So pilgrimage falls into a certain amount of neglect, particularly following the Protestant Reformation. Thinkers like Luther were very critical of pilgrimage. So for many Protestants, pilgrimage was not really a common practice. But interestingly, in our time, we've seen all the branches of Christianity taking up pilgrimage again and reclaiming. So when I was looking up that pilgrim Egeria, it's on many Protestant sites. They're claiming her as a kind of ancestress. So this is showing you the way that religion changes and develops over time in response to what's going on politically and economically and so on. But certainly when we see the revival of pilgrimage, it's coming from the people. So if we look at the Compostela, it went from a few thousand people to hundreds of thousands of people over 20 years, partly because people were writing accounts of going on the pilgrimage. So famous writers were writing about it in the 1990s, 1980s, and sort of, that's not the only reason it revivified, but it certainly contributed to it. So we're coming to the end of the lecture, and so I wanted to give you the context and history of how this develops, how and why these hospice or hostels develop, and that they're serving a variety of functions. And we're going to see this when we also look at the evolution of the hospital in Western society, that it emerges from a similar kind of matrix of the churches and the monasteries, and providing basically, how do you provide care for people? So for the elderly, for the poor, for the sick. And so these various institutions start to develop within the Christian world. And so just to recap, they were located along pilgrimage routes to provide a place of rest. So that was the initial kind of impetus to facilitate their journey. Established by religious orders such as the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, which I talked about in the earlier lecture. So these orders would oversee these hostels or hospices. And so this is also related to the idea that this is dangerous. So they would oversee their actual protection as well. And so they were knights, they were armed, and they could protect these pilgrims. So the hospices were usually located near churches or monasteries and operated by monks or nuns with a shrine where pilgrims could attend mass or other religious rituals. And this remains true into the present day, that these are often part of a larger religious complex overseen by priests, monks, and nuns. Although in the contemporary period, they may just be overseen by regular people who may well be Christian and doing it out of kind of Christian devotion. Although not always. Sometimes they're doing it just like Airbnb and they're making money. So these hospices also would provide healthcare for pilgrims. So here we come to the creation of the hospice that leads us into the contemporary period, that it develops out of a sense of need and necessity for caring for these pilgrims, and becomes the model and the template for what develops out into the contemporary period as hospice. So I wanted to end by saying that, again, I think this is very common with religion in general, that people think, oh, that's something from the past, oh, the medieval period, yes. But in fact, as I said at the very beginning, pilgrimage is becoming more and more popular. And as it always was, there's a mixture of economic motive. And so the Spanish have been taking note of this. And that's not to say it's not a very religious country. It is. Many religious people in Spain, as you probably know. But certainly it also has economic drivers for if you're bringing all these tourists into Spain. And so I came across this article which was directed at tourists. And so we see that strange overlay of tourism and religious pilgrimage that is very particular for our time period. And so the article says, Madrid becomes a gateway to the Camino de Santiago. So the Camino developed particularly when getting to Jerusalem became difficult. And so I'm not going to try to read the Spanish. I'm not going to put you through that. So we see that the Spanish government has been behind the opening of a new hostel in Madrid. And so they're kind of angling to have that be where people could start the Compostela. So you can start it from a variety of places. So look at this building. It's so beautiful. And so I have to say, as somebody from North America, I think for a lot of us, when we go to these countries, it's just being in these old buildings. It's probably not as true for people from Europe, but certainly if you're from Canada, to be in these beautiful old buildings is part of the whole allure of it. And so this current, they're calling it a hostel, contains 26 beds. It says it's designed primarily for international pilgrims arriving in Madrid by plane or train, offering a calm space to rest, prepare, and reflect before setting off on foot. Okay, so they're angling for these pilgrims or tourists. And so they're also setting themselves up as a central site where you learn about the cultural, historical, and spiritual aspects of the pilgrimage. And I find this very interesting because obviously Spain historically was a very important site of Christianity and the spreading of Christianity, certainly in places like South America and Central America. And so it's interesting to see the way it is now setting itself up and creating one of the most beautiful hostels on any of the pilgrimage routes.